Over there about this time old Judd concluded suddenly to go West, taking Bud with him, and when Hale wrote the fact an answer came from June that showed the blot of tears. However, she seemed none the less in a hurry to get back, and when Hale met her at the station he was startled, for she came back in dresses that were below her shoe tops, with her wonderful hair massed in a golden glory on the top of her head, and a little fairy cross dangling at a woman's throat. Her figure had rounded, her voice had softened. She held herself as straight as a young poplar, and she walked the earth as though she had come straight from Olympus. And still, in spite of her new feathers and airs and graces, there was in her eyes and in her laugh and in her moods all the subtle wild charm of the child in Lonesome Cove. It was fairy time for June that summer. Though her father and Bud had gone West, for her stepmother was living with a sister, the cabin in Lonesome Cove was closed, and June stayed at the Gap, not at the Widow Crane's boarding house, but with one of Hale's married friends on Poplar Hill. And always was she, young as she was, one of the merry parties of that happy summer, even at the dances, for the dance, too, June had learned. Moreover, she had picked up the guitar, and many times when Hale had been out in the hills, he would hear her silver clear voice floating out into the moonlight as he made his way toward Poplar Hill, and he would stop under the beeches and listen with ears of growing love to the wonder of it all. For it was he who was the ardent one of the two now. June was no longer the frank, impulsive child who stood at the foot of the beach doggedly reckless if all the world knew her love for him. She had taken flight to some inner recesses where it was difficult for Hale to follow, and right puzzled he was to discover that he must now win again what an ask she had once so freely given. Bob Berkley, too, had developed amazingly. He no longer said sir to Hale. That was bad form at Harvard. He called him by his first name and looked him in the eye as a man to man. Just as June, Hale observed, no longer seemed in any awe of Miss Anne Saunders, and to have lost all jealousy of her, or of anybody else. So swiftly had her instinct caught her now, she had nothing to fear, and Bob and June seemed mighty pleased with each other, and sometimes Hale, watching them as they galloped past him on horseback, laughing and bantering, felt foolish to think of their perfect fitness, the one for their other, and the incongruity of himself in a relationship that would so naturally be theirs. At one thing he wondered. She had made an extraordinary record at school, and it seemed to him that it was partly through the consciousness that her brain would take care of itself, that she could pay such heed to what hitherto she had no chance to learn: dress, manners, deportment, and speech. Indeed, it was curious that she seemed to lay most stress on the very things to which he, because of his long rough life in the mountains, was growing more and more indifferent. It was quite plain that Bob, with his extreme gallantry of manner, his smart clothes, his high ways, and his unconquerable gaiety, had supplanted him on the pedestal where he had been the year before, just as somebody somewhere, his sister perhaps, had supplanted Miss Anne. Several times, indeed, June had corrected Hale's slips of tongue with mischievous triumph, and once, when he came back late from a long trip in the mountains and walked in to dinner without changing his clothes, Hale saw her look from himself to the immaculate Bob with an unconscious comparison that half amused, half worried him. The truth was, he was building a lovely Frankenstein, and from wondering what he was going to do with it, he was beginning to wonder now what it might some day do with him. And though he sometimes joked with Miss Anne, who had withdrawn now to the level plane of friendship with him, about the transformation that was going on, he worried in a way that did neither his heart nor his brain good. Still, he fought both to little purpose all that summer, and it was not till the time was nigh when June must go away again that he spoke both. For Hale's sister was going to marry, and it was her advice that he should take June to New York, if only for the sake of her music and her voice. That very day June had for the first time seen her cousin Dave. He was on horseback, he had been drinking, and he pulled in and without an answer to her greeting stared her over from head to foot. Coloring angrily, she stared on, and then he spoke thickly and with a sneer. "'Bout fine size now, ain't ye?"
I reckon maybe if you keep on you'll be good enough for him in a year or more."
"I'm much obliged for those apples, Dave," said June quietly, and Dave flushed a darker red and sat still, forgetting to renew the old threat that was on his tongue. But his taunt rankled in the girl, rankled more now than when Dave first made it, for she better saw the truth of it, and the hurt was the greater to her unconquerable pride that kept her from betraying the hurt to Dave long ago. And now, when he was making an old wound bleed afresh. But the pain was with her at dinner that night and through the evening. She avoided Hale's eyes, though she knew that he was watching her all the time, and her instinct told her that something was going to happen that night, and what that something was. Hale was the last to go, and when he called to her from the porch, she went out trembling and stood at the head of the steps in the moonlight. "I love you, little girl," he said simply, "and I want you to marry me some day. Will you, June?" She was unsurprised, but she flushed under his hungry eyes, and the little cross throbbed at her throat. "Some day, not now," she thought, and then with equal simplicity, "Yes, Jack, and if you should love somebody else more, you'll tell me right away, won't you, June?" She shrank a little and her eyes fell, but straightway she raised them steadily. "Yes, Jack." "Thank you, little girl. Good night." "Good night, Jack." Hale saw the little shrinking movement she made, and as he went down the hill he thought she seemed to be in a hurry to be alone, and that she caught her breath sharply as he turned away, and brooding, he walked the woods long that night. Only a few days later they started for New York, and with all her dreaming, June had never dreamed that the world could be so large. Mountains, the vast stretches of rolling hills and level land, melted away from her wondering eyes. Towns and cities sank behind them. Swift streams, swollen by freshets, were outstripped and left behind. Darkness came on, and through it they sped on. Once during the night she woke from a troubled dream in her berth, and for a moment she thought she was at home again. They were running through the mountains again, and there they lay in the moonlight, the great calm dark faces that she knew and loved, and she seemed to catch the odor of the earth and feel the cool air on her face. But there was no pang of homesickness now. She was too eager for the world into which she was going. Next morning the air was cooler, the skies lower and grayer. The big city was close at hand. Then came the water, shaking and sparkling in the early light like a great cauldron of quicksilver, and the wonderful Brooklyn Bridge, a ribbon of twinkling lights tossed out through the mist from the mighty city that rose from the mist as from a fantastic dream. Then the picking of the way through the screeching little boats and noiseless big ones and white bird-like floating things that then they disappeared like two tiny grains in a shifting human tide of sand. But Hale was happy now, for on the trip June had come back to herself and to him once more, and now awed but unafraid, eager, bubbling, up-looking, full of quaint questions about everything she saw. She was once more sitting with an affectionate reverence at his feet. When he left her in a great low house that fronted on the majestic Hudson, June clung to him with tears and of her own accord kissed him for the first time since she had torn her little playhouse to pieces at the foot of the beach down in the mountains far away. And Hale went back with peace in his heart, but to trouble in the hills. Not suddenly did the boom drop down there, not like a falling star, but on the wings of hope, wings that ever fluttering upward, yet sank inexorably and slowly closed. The first crash came over the waters when certain big men over there went to pieces, men on whose shoulders rested the colossal figures of progress that the English were carving from the hills at Cumberland Gap. Still nobody saw why a hurt to the lion should make the eagle soar, and so the American spirit at the other gaps and all up the Virginia valleys and skirt of the Cumberland held faithful and dauntless for a while. But in time, as the huge steel plants grew noiseless and the flaming throats of the furnaces were throttled, a sympathetic fire of dissolution spread slowly north and south, and it was plain only to the wise outsider as merely a matter of time until all up and down the Cumberland the fox and the coon and the quail